The morning sun cast long shadows across the private airport as Richard Thompson stepped out of his black sedan. He was one of those men who commanded attention without trying, tall, well-dressed, and carrying himself with the confidence that only comes from having built a tech empire worth billions. But today, something was different. His usual composed demeanor showed cracks of worry around the edges. "Come on, buddy. Time to go," he called softly to the car, where his 12-year-old son, Alex, sat clutching a worn, stuffed elephant. The boy's dark hair fell across his eyes as he rocked back and forth in the back seat, humming a tune only he could hear. Richard's phone buzzed for the 10th time that morning, another urgent message about the London merger that could either make or break his company's future. He glanced at the screen, then back at Alex, feeling that familiar weight in his chest. How was he supposed to handle both? Mrs. Chen, Alex's nanny for the past 5 years, had been their lifeline. She understood Alex's routines, his triggers, his silent language of gestures and sounds. But last night, she'd called in tears. Her elderly mother had suffered a stroke back in Taiwan, and she needed to leave immediately. Richard had offered his private jet, money, anything she needed, but the damage was done. For the first time in years, he was completely alone with his son. "I know this is hard, Alex," Richard said, sliding into the back seat beside him. The boy's rocking intensified at the change in routine. "But we have to take this trip together, okay? Just you and me." Alex didn't respond with words, he rarely did. Instead, he pressed his face against the car window, watching the sleek white jet that sat waiting on the tarmac. His hands flapped, nervously, a behavior that Richard had learned was Alex's way of managing overwhelming feelings. The walk to the plane felt like climbing a mountain. Alex stopped every few steps, overwhelmed by the unfamiliar sounds of the airport. The whir of engines, the voices of ground crew, the smell of jet fuel. Everything was different from their usual routine of quiet mornings at home. "Sir, we're ready when you are," called Captain Williams from the cockpit door. He'd flown the Thompson family many times and always kept his interactions brief and professional. Today, he noticed the tension immediately. Richard's business partners were already aboard, reviewing documents and making calls. There was Peterson from the investment firm, looking sharp in his navy suit. Chen from the tech division was typing, furiously on his laptop, probably fixing some last-minute code issue. And Rodriguez from legal sat quietly, her briefcase full of contracts that needed Richard's signature before they landed in London. As they climbed the stairs to the plane, Alex suddenly stopped. His breathing became rapid and shallow. The unfamiliar environment was hitting him all at once. The narrow stairs, the height, the sound of his footsteps echoing differently than they did at home. "It's okay, buddy," Richard whispered, though his own heart was racing. He'd watched Mrs. Chen handle these moments with patience and understanding. She would crouch down to Alex's level, speak in calm tones, give him time to process. But Richard felt clumsy trying to copy her methods. The inside of the plane felt smaller than usual, with Alex's anxiety filling the space. The boy's eyes darted around, taking in every detail. The leather seats that were a different color than their car, the windows that showed nothing but sky, the faces of strangers who were watching him with poorly hidden curiosity. "Maybe he should sit in the back," Peterson suggested quietly, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. Richard felt his jaw tighten. "He'll sit with me," he said firmly, though he wasn't sure that was any better. Alex needed routine, predictability, comfort. This luxurious flying conference room was none of those things. As the engine started up, Alex's humming grew louder. It was his way of self-soothing, Richard knew, but it mixed strangely with the sound of the jet engines. The vibration of the plane seemed to go straight through the boy's small body, making him rock more intensely in his seat. "Sir, we need everyone buckled in for takeoff," the flight attendant said gently. Her name tag read Keisha, and she had kind eyes that seemed to take in the whole situation without judgment. Getting Alex buckled was a battle. He didn't like the feeling of being trapped, and the seatbelt felt different from the one in their car. Richard's hands shook slightly as he tried to help, remembering how Mrs. Chen would sing quietly while doing the same task, how she made everything seem normal and safe. "First flight together?" Keisha asked, her voice warm and understanding. "Something like that," Richard replied, not wanting to explain the complicated truth to a stranger. As the plane began to taxi, Alex's distress became more obvious. His hands moved frantically, his breathing quick and uneven. The familiar routine of ground, of home, of safety was disappearing beneath them, and nothing Richard said seemed to help. The successful businessman who could negotiate million-dollar deals and command boardrooms full of executives felt completely lost. He watched his son struggle and realized with growing horror that he didn't really know how to help. For years, he'd provided everything money could buy: the best doctors, therapists, schools, caregivers, but he'd never learned the small daily skills of actually caring for Alex himself. His phone buzzed again. London was waiting. Contracts needed signing. Millions of dollars hung in the balance. But all of that seemed meaningless as he looked at his son, who was becoming more agitated by the minute. The plane lifted off the ground and Alex let out a cry that cut through the engine noise. Richard reached for him instinctively, but his touch only seemed to make things worse. The boy pulled away, his whole body rigid with panic. Peterson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Chen put on noise-canceling headphones. Rodriguez pretended to be absorbed in her paperwork. They were all trying to be polite, but Richard could feel their discomfort, their questions, their judgment. This was going to be the longest flight of his life, and they'd barely left the ground. Richard closed his eyes and tried to remember what Mrs. Chen would do, but his mind was blank. He was a billionaire who could solve almost any problem with money or influence, but he couldn't help his own son feel safe on an airplane. The irony wasn't lost on him. He owned the plane, employed the crew, controlled every aspect of this journey, except the one that mattered most. Alex's fear was something that couldn't be bought, negotiated, or managed like a business deal. It was real and raw and completely beyond Richard's expertise. As the plane climbed higher into the morning sky, Richard Thompson, successful entrepreneur, tech innovator, master of his universe, sat helpless beside his frightened son and wondered how he'd become such a failure at the only job that truly mattered. 2 hours into the flight, Richard thought the worst was over. Alex had settled into a restless quiet, still rocking in his seat but no longer crying. The plane had reached cruising altitude, and the engine noise had become a steady hum instead of the roaring chaos of takeoff. Richard had even managed to review a few contracts, though his attention kept drifting to his son. That's when everything fell apart. It started small, the way these things always did. Alex began making a soft clicking sound with his tongue, something he did when he was trying to stay calm. But the clicking got faster, more urgent. His hands, which had been still for the past hour, started moving again. First just his fingers, tapping against his leg, then his whole hands flapping like small birds trying to escape. Richard looked up from his paperwork, immediately alert. He'd learned to read these signs over the years, even if he didn't always know what to do about them. "Hey buddy, you okay?" he asked quietly, hoping his business partners wouldn't notice. But Alex wasn't okay, not even close. The boy's breathing became rapid and shallow. His eyes, usually so focused on some internal world, were darting around the cabin like he was trapped in a cage. The clicking sounds turned into small whimpers, then grew louder. Much louder. "No, no, no," Alex started, repeating, his voice rising with each word. "No, no, 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 no." Richard felt his heart sink. He unbuckled his seatbelt and moved closer to Alex, but that only made things worse. The moment his dad reached for him, Alex pulled away so violently that he hit his elbow against the window. "Don't touch," Alex screamed, his voice cutting through the cabin like a knife. "Don't touch, don't touch, don't touch." Peterson looked up from his phone, his eyebrows raised in alarm. Chen pulled off his headphones, clearly annoyed by the disruption. Rodriguez stopped pretending to read and stared openly at the unfolding scene. "Alex, please," Richard said, trying to keep his voice calm even though panic was rising in his chest. "We're just flying, remember? Like the planes we watch at home?" But Alex was beyond reasoning. The sensory overload that had been building since they left the ground was finally too much. The recycled air felt wrong in his lungs. The slight turbulence made his stomach feel strange. The pressure in his ears hurt. Everything was wrong, 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 and he couldn't make it stop. He started hitting himself, his small fists striking the sides of his head rhythmically. It was something he did when the world became too overwhelming, a way to create a sensation he could control when everything else felt chaotic. "Alex, don't do that," Richard said, reaching out instinctively to stop him. But the moment he touched his son's hands, Alex's screaming reached a new level. "Stop! Stop! Stop!" The boy shrieked, his whole body rigid with panic. He kicked at the seat in front of him, sending papers flying from Peterson's lap. "Jesus," Peterson muttered, scrambling to collect his documents. "Can't you do something?" Richard felt his face burn with embarrassment and helplessness. In boardrooms, he was known for his calm under pressure, his ability to handle any crisis. But this wasn't a business problem that could be solved with logic and negotiation. This was his son in pain, and he had no idea how to help. "Alex, look at me," he tried, his voice getting louder to match his son's volume. "Look at Daddy. We're safe. We're going to London, remember? For the meeting?" But Alex couldn't hear him over his own distress. The boy was now thrashing in his seat, trying to escape from the seatbelt that held him in place. His stuffed elephant fell to the floor, and when Richard bent to pick it up, Alex's screaming intensified. "Maybe we should call ahead," Chen suggested, his voice tight with discomfort. "Get some medical help waiting when we land?" "He's not sick," Richard snapped, then immediately regretted his tone. But the suggestion felt like another judgment, another way of saying his son wasn't normal, wasn't manageable, wasn't welcome in their world of business suits and important meetings. Alex was now throwing anything he could reach. The in-flight magazine went flying across the aisle. His juice cup, thankfully empty, bounced off Rodriguez's briefcase. His hands moved frantically, grabbing at anything within reach and hurling it away from him. "I can't make it stop." He was crying now, his words barely understandable through his sobs. "I can't make it stop. Help me, help me." Those words hit Richard like a physical blow. His son was begging for help. And Richard, who could move millions of dollars with a phone call, who had built a company from nothing, who was respected and feared in business circles around the world, couldn't help his own child. The other passengers weren't even trying to hide their stares anymore. Peterson had his phone out, probably texting someone about the delay this might cause their London meeting. Chen was looking toward the cockpit, maybe wondering if they should consider an emergency landing. Rodriguez was pressed against her window, as far from the chaos as she could get. Richard felt completely alone, more alone than he'd ever felt in his life. Mrs. Chen would have known what to do. She had techniques, strategies, ways of reaching Alex when he got like this. But she was thousands of miles away, dealing with her own family crisis. And Richard was here fumbling through the worst parenting moment of his life in front of an audience. "Please, Alex," he whispered, his own voice breaking. "Please tell me what you need." But Alex couldn't tell him. The boy was too far gone, lost in a storm of sensory overload and emotional chaos that Richard couldn't understand, let alone navigate. All he could do was watch his son suffer and feel like the most useless father in the world. The cabin felt smaller by the minute, filled with Alex's cries and the heavy silence of uncomfortable witnesses. Richard looked around desperately, hoping for some miracle, some solution, some way to undo the decision to bring Alex on this trip. The flight attendant appeared at the front of the cabin, drawn by the commotion. Richard caught her eye and saw something there, not judgment or annoyance, but understanding. She moved toward them with purpose, and for the first time since takeoff, Richard felt a tiny spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, someone knew how to help his son when he couldn't. Keisha had been a flight attendant for 15 years, and she'd seen it all. Drunk passengers, medical emergencies, business deals gone wrong at 30,000 feet. But the sound coming from the main cabin was different. It wasn't anger or entitlement or fear of flying. It was pure distress, the kind that came from a place deeper than words could reach. She finished securing the galley and moved toward the sound, her practiced eye taking in the scene immediately. A well-dressed man knelt beside a young boy who was clearly in the middle of a complete meltdown. The boy's movements were repetitive and urgent, his cries echoing through the small space. 3 other passengers sat frozen in their seats looking anywhere but at the chaos unfolding in front of them. Keisha had seen this before, but not on a plane. Her nephew Tyler was 14 now, and she'd watched him go through episodes just like this one. She'd learned from her sister how to read the signs, how to help when the world became too much for a child whose brain worked differently than most. "Sir," she said quietly, approaching Richard with careful steps. She kept her voice low and calm the way she'd learned worked best. "I'd like to help, if that's okay." Richard looked up at her with desperate eyes. His expensive shirt was wrinkled, his usually perfect hair disheveled from running his hands through it. "I don't know what to do," he admitted, his voice barely audible over Alex's cries. "His nanny usually handles this, but she couldn't come, and It's okay," Keisha said, and something in her tone made Richard step back slightly. Not dismissively, but hopefully like he was finally willing to let someone else try. Keisha crouched down, but not too close to Alex. She'd learned that approaching too quickly or getting too near could make things worse. Instead, she positioned herself where he could see her if he wanted to, but didn't feel trapped or crowded. "Hey there," she said softly, not expecting an answer. Alex was still hitting his head with his fists, his whole body rigid with overwhelm. "That looks really hard. All those feelings at once must be scary." Richard watched in amazement as Keisha simply sat there, not trying to stop Alex or make him do anything. She just existed in his space, calm and patient, like she had all the time in the world. "You know what?" she continued, her voice steady and rhythmic. "Sometimes when my nephew feels like this, we change things up a little, make the world feel different." She reached up and dimmed the cabin lights without asking permission from anyone. The harsh brightness that had been adding to Alex's sensory overload softened into something warmer, easier. "That's better," she said, though Alex was still crying. "Sometimes the world is just too bright, isn't it?" She opened one of the overhead bins and pulled out a blanket from the first-class bedding supplies. But not just any blanket. She chose the heaviest one, the thick wool throw that was meant for cold flights. "This might help too," she said, still not reaching for Alex directly. Instead, she held the blanket where he could see it, letting him decide if he wanted it or not. Alex's movements were still frantic, but something about Keisha's presence was different from everyone else who had tried to help. She wasn't rushing him or demanding that he stop or trying to fix him. She was just there, solid and calm in the middle of his storm. "I have a nephew about your age," she continued talking, her voice like a gentle rhythm under his distress. "He has days when everything feels too much. The sounds are too loud, the lights are too bright, people want him to do things too fast. Is that how you're feeling right now?" For the first time since the meltdown started, Alex's cries shifted slightly. Not stopping, but changing. Like he was hearing her somewhere through the chaos in his head. Richard stared at this woman who seemed to understand his son better in 5 minutes than he had in 12 years. "How did you know?" he started to ask. "Experience," Keisha said simply, never taking her eyes off Alex. "And paying attention. He's not being difficult, he's overwhelmed, there's a big difference." She slowly, carefully, reached into her uniform pocket and pulled out her phone. Instead of trying to distract Alex with games or videos, she opened her photo gallery and found what she was looking for. Pictures she'd taken on flights over the years. Clouds from above, the curve of the earth from 30,000 feet, the wing of the plane cutting through blue sky. "Look at where we are," she said, holding the phone where Alex could see it if he chose to. "We're flying through the clouds right now, like being inside a cloud castle." Alex's hitting slowed, just a little. His eyes flicked toward the phone, then away, then back again. "That's the ground way down there," Keisha continued, swiping to another photo. "All those tiny lights are people in their houses having dinner, watching TV, getting ready for bed. And here we are, flying above it all like we're magic." The rhythm of Alex's rocking changed, became less frantic, and more like a gentle sway. He was listening now, even if he couldn't show it in ways most people would recognize. Richard felt tears start to form in his eyes, not from embarrassment this time, but from something deeper. This stranger was reaching his son in a way he'd never been able to. She was speaking a language he'd never learned, seeing Alex as a person instead of a problem to be solved. Peterson, Chen, and Rodriguez were watching too, but their expressions had changed. The annoyance was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like understanding. They were seeing Alex differently now, not as a disruption to their important business trip, but as a frightened child who needed help. "The plane is like a big, safe room that flies," Keisha said, still showing photos. "It has strong walls and smart pilots who know exactly where we're going. You're safe in here. Your dad is safe. Everyone is safe." Alex's breathing was starting to slow down. The terrible, panicked gasping was becoming more regular, more normal. His hands were still moving, but the violent hitting had stopped. "Would you like this blanket?" Keisha asked, holding it out without moving closer. "It's heavy. Some people like heavy things when they feel scared. It's like getting a really big, warm hug." For a moment, nobody breathed. Then, slowly, Alex reached out and touched the blanket. Just his fingertips at first, testing the texture, the weight. Then his whole hand, then both hands, pulling it toward himself. Richard watched his son wrap the heavy blanket around his shoulders, like armor against the overwhelming world, and felt something break open in his chest. Relief, gratitude, and something else. A recognition that he had so much to learn about being Alex's father. With the heavy blanket wrapped around him like a protective cocoon, Alex's world began to feel manageable again. The screaming had stopped, replaced by quiet sniffles and the occasional shuddering breath that comes after crying hard. But he was still fragile, still teetering on the edge of another meltdown. Keisha knew this was the most crucial moment. Getting someone calm was only half the battle. Keeping them calm was often harder. One wrong move, one sudden noise, one well-meaning but misguided attempt to help could send everything spiraling again. She settled onto the floor beside Alex's seat, making herself smaller, less threatening. From her pocket, she pulled out a small stress ball that she always carried, not for passengers but for herself during particularly turbulent flights. But today, it might serve a different purpose. "Sometimes when Tyler gets really upset," she said quietly, beginning to squeeze the ball rhythmically. "His whole body feels tight and scared, so we do exercises to help everything relax again." Alex watched her hands through the corner of his eye, still not ready to make direct eye contact but clearly interested. The repetitive motion was soothing, predictable in a way that felt safe. "Want to try?" she asked, holding out the stress ball, not pushing it toward him, just offering. Alex looked at the small blue ball, then at his own hands, which were still trembling slightly under the blanket. Slowly, carefully, he reached out and took it. The moment his fingers closed around it, something in his posture shifted. Having something to do with his hands, something that felt good to squeeze, gave him a focus point for all that anxious energy. "That's perfect," Keisha said, her voice warm with genuine praise. "Just like that. Squeeze when you breathe in, relax when you breathe out." She demonstrated, taking slow, deep breaths while Alex watched. His own breathing began to match, hers without her having to ask. In through the nose, out through the mouth, squeeze the ball, release the ball. It was a rhythm, a pattern, something his brain could latch onto and follow. Richard sat frozen in his seat, afraid to move and break whatever magic was happening. He'd never seen Alex respond to a stranger like this. Usually, new people made. His son more anxious, not less. But Keisha was different. She wasn't trying too hard, wasn't overwhelming him with attention or demands. "You know what's really cool about airplanes?" Keisha continued, pulling out her phone again. "They're like time machines. When we took off this morning, it was breakfast time at home. But when we land in London, it'll be dinner time there. We're flying through time." She showed Alex her phone's world clock, with different cities displaying different times. "Look, it's still morning where we started, but it's already afternoon in London. Pretty amazing, right?" Alex's eyes focused on the screen, following her finger as she pointed to different time zones. Numbers and patterns were something his brain found comforting. Unlike people's faces or voices, numbers were predictable, logical, safe. My nephew loves numbers too, Keisha said, noticing his interest. He can tell you what day of the week any date falls on, going back years. Brains like yours are pretty special. It was the first time anyone had called Alex's differences special in a positive way, at least that Richard could remember. Usually people talked about Alex's autism like it was something to be fixed or overcome, not celebrated. Alex made a small sound, not quite a word, but an acknowledgement that he was listening. His hands were still working the stress ball, but his breathing was steady now, normal. Would you like to see where we are right now? Keisha asked, switching to a flight tracker app on her phone. This little airplane icon, that's us. See how we're moving across the map? Alex leaned forward slightly, drawn in by the moving graphics. He watched the tiny plane creep across the digital Atlantic, leaving a trail behind it like breadcrumbs showing where they'd been. We're about halfway there, Keisha explained. Flying right over the ocean. Down below us there might be whales swimming, or ships carrying cargo from one country to another. We're all traveling together, just at different heights. For the eye, first time since the flight began, Alex seemed genuinely interested in something. His rocking had stopped completely, replaced by an intense focus on the phone screen. Richard felt his heart clench with something between joy and sadness. Joy that his son was engaged. Sadness that it had taken a stranger to reach him this way. Tyler likes to make up stories about the places we fly over, Keisha continued. Want to make up a story about what's happening down there in the ocean? Alex looked at her directly for the first time, just for a second before looking away again. But it was progress. Real, visible progress. Whales, he said quietly, his first word since the meltdown began. Big whales singing. Oh, that's beautiful, Keisha responded immediately. What are they singing about? Alex squeezed the stress ball thoughtfully. Singing to their babies, teaching them the way home. Richard felt tears spring to his eyes. Alex rarely spoke in full sentences with strangers, rarely shared his imagination with anyone outside their immediate family. But here he was, creating stories with a woman he'd known for less than an hour. That's perfect, Keisha said. Mama whales teaching their babies how to navigate the big ocean, just like how your dad brought you on this airplane to see new places. She glanced up at Richard, including him in the conversation for the first time. Dads want to share their world with their kids, even when it's scary and new. Alex looked, between Keisha and his father, processing this idea. Richard held his breath, hoping his son might see him as more than just the person who didn't understand, who couldn't help when things got overwhelming. The baby whales get scared sometimes, Alex said, still looking at the phone screen. The ocean is very big. They do get scared, Keisha agreed. But they're not alone. Their families are right there with them, and there are kind strangers swimming nearby who want to help if they need it. The meaning wasn't lost on anyone in the cabin. Alex had been the scared baby whale. Richard was the worried parent, and Keisha was the kind stranger. Somehow, in talking about whales in the ocean below, they were also talking about what had just happened in the airplane above. Alex pulled the blanket tighter around himself and leaned back in his seat, still holding the stress ball. His eyes were getting heavy. The emotional exhaustion of the meltdown was catching up with him. Sometimes after Tyler has a really hard time, he gets very sleepy, Keisha said softly. It takes a lot of energy to feel so much all at once. If her words were permission, Alex's eyes began to close. The stress ball rolled gently in his relaxed hands, and his breathing deepened into the rhythm of approaching sleep. Within minutes, his head had tilted toward Keisha's shoulder, and he was fast asleep. Richard stared at his son, peaceful at last, resting against a woman who had shown them both what understanding looked like. The cabin was quiet now except for the steady hum of engines and Alex's peaceful breathing. He slept deeply against Keisha's shoulder, his small body finally relaxed after hours of tension. The heavy blanket rose and fell gently with each breath. and his hand still clutched the stress ball loosely, like a talisman that had carried him through the storm. Richard sat in his seat, watching this scene that seemed impossible just an hour ago. His son, who had been in complete meltdown, was now sleeping peacefully against a stranger. But Keisha wasn't really a stranger anymore, was she? In the span of one flight, she had become something Richard had never been able to be. Someone who truly understood Alex. The realization hit him like a physical blow. 12 years. 12 years of being Alex's father. And he had never once been able to calm his son the way this woman had done in minutes. He had provided everything money could buy: therapists, special schools, the best medical care, adaptive equipment, a full-time nanny. But he had never learned the most basic skill of all: how to be present with his son when Alex needed him most. Tears began to blur his vision. Not the frustrated tears of earlier, but something deeper, more painful. These were tears of recognition, of shame, of profound gratitude, all mixed together. "Sir?" Keisha's voice was soft, careful not to wake Alex. "Are you okay?" Richard looked up at her. This woman who had saved not just his son, but maybe their entire relationship, and felt his composure crumble completely. The successful businessman, the tech mogul, the man who commanded respect in boardrooms across the world, broke down and cried. "I don't know how to help him," he whispered, the words barely audible. "I'm his father, and I don't know how to help my own son." Keisha's expression was full of compassion, not judgment. She had seen this before. Parents who loved their children desperately but felt lost in translation between their world and their child's needs. "You love him," she said simply. "That's not nothing. But love isn't always enough, is it? Sometimes we need to learn new languages, new ways of seeing the world." Richard wiped his eyes, trying to pull himself together, but the tears kept coming. "His nanny, Mrs. Chen, she's been with us for 5 years. She knows exactly what to do, always. And I write checks, I hire people, I provide things, but when it really mattered, when he needed me, I was useless." "You weren't useless," Keisha said firmly. "You were learning. There's a difference." She adjusted her position slightly, making sure Alex was still comfortable against her shoulder. "My sister felt the same way when Tyler was first diagnosed. She thought she was failing him because she didn't instinctively know how to handle his meltdowns or understand his needs. But nobody is born knowing this stuff. We learn by watching, by trying, by making mistakes, and by accepting help when it's offered." Richard looked at his sleeping son, peaceful now in a way he rarely was when awake. He doesn't usually connect with strangers like this. What did you do differently?" "I didn't try to fix him," Keisha said. "I didn't try to make him stop feeling what he was feeling. I just tried to make the world a little easier for him to handle while he worked through it himself." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Alex isn't broken. His brain just processes things differently. The meltdown wasn't him being difficult. It was him being overwhelmed. Once I understood that, I could help him find ways to manage the overwhelm instead of fighting it." Richard felt another wave of emotion wash over him. How many times had he tried to stop Alex's stimming, his rocking, his repetitive behaviors? How many times had he seen these things as problems to be solved instead of Alex's natural ways of coping with a world that often felt too intense? "I've been doing everything wrong," he said, the admission painful but necessary. "Not wrong," Keisha corrected gently. "Just differently than what Alex needed. But that can change. You can learn." Peterson cleared his throat softly from across the aisle. During the crisis, Richard had forgotten his business partners were even there. Now he looked over to see all three of them watching with expressions that had completely transformed from their earlier discomfort. "Richard," Peterson said quietly, "I had no idea. I mean, I knew Alex was different, but I didn't understand what that meant for you, for him." Chen nodded, his usual impatience replaced by something that looked like respect. "The way she handled that," he said, gesturing toward Keisha, "that was incredible. Is that something you can learn?" "Everything can be learned," Keisha answered before Richard could speak. "It just takes willingness to see the world through someone else's eyes." Rodriguez leaned forward slightly. My daughter is a special education teacher. She's always talking about how parents need support too, not just the kids. Maybe there are resources, classes. Richard felt overwhelmed again, but in a different way. These people, his business associates who he'd expected to be annoyed or judgmental, were offering help, showing understanding. The shame he'd carried for so long about Alex's differences began to feel a little lighter. There are support groups, Keisha said. Classes for parents. Therapists who specialize in helping families navigate autism together. Tyler's mom found a whole community of parents who understand what it's like. She says it changed everything. Alex stirred slightly in his sleep, making a small sound. Instinctively, Keisha began humming very softly, the same gentle tune she'd used earlier to calm him. He settled immediately, sinking deeper into peaceful sleep. "Teach me," Richard said suddenly, the words coming out before he'd fully formed the thought. "I mean, if you're willing. When we land, could you help me learn how to do what you just did?" Keisha looked surprised. "Sir, I'm just a flight attendant. I'm not a therapist or a specialist." "You're someone who understands my son," Richard said firmly. "You're someone who sees him as a person, not a problem. That's exactly what I need to learn." He paused, then made a decision that surprised even himself. "The London meeting can wait. Peterson, Chen, Rodriguez, you can handle the preliminaries without me. I need to take Alex home and start figuring out how to be the father he needs." The business partners exchanged glances, but nobody argued. They had all witnessed something that put million-dollar deals into perspective. "Mrs. Chen won't be back for at least 2 weeks," Richard continued, speaking directly to Keisha now. "Alex will need someone who understands him, and honestly, so will I. Would you consider, I know it's not your usual job, but would you think about helping us? Teaching me what you know?" Keisha looked down at Alex, still sleeping peacefully against her shoulder, then back at Richard. She saw a father who had finally understood that love wasn't enough. That understanding was what his son truly needed. "I have vacation time saved up," she said slowly. "And Tyler's mom always says the world needs more people who get it." Richard felt hope bloom in his chest for the first time in years. Not hope that Alex would change or become normal, but hope that he could change, could learn to meet his son where he was instead of trying to pull him into a world that didn't fit. As the plane began its descent toward London, Richard made a silent promise to his sleeping son. He would learn Alex's language. He would become the father Alex deserved. And he would never again feel helpless when his child needed him most. The Chan, successful businessman who had built an empire, was ready to learn the most important skill of his life: how to truly be Alex's dad.